Happy Monday. For those unfamiliar, my name is Jack Gorsline, founder of Psychedelic States of America. And this is another edition of the Psychedelic States of America Monday News Roundup, powered by our friends at Psychedelics Today and brought to you live from here in Southeast Washington, D.C. Really interesting show that we have for you all today. No shortage of updates across the state level psychedelic policy sphere, as well as some interesting new excuse making from a psychedelic megadonor of great repute. And then lastly, a preview of some really interesting stuff going on here in DC this week, including the annual Cannabis Week of Unity, which I will be on the ground covering in all ways, big and small, for Filter Magazine as the week wears on. An exciting event happening at the National Press Club this Thursday, hosted by the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, set to feature some of the biggest names and sitting members of Congress involved in the psychedelic advocacy sphere, as it's known. And then lastly, we'll dig a little bit into highlighting a really exciting event that I'm particularly pumped to be co-hosting this Friday here in DC, the DC Plant Medicine Freedom Forum. Say that 5 times fast. I dare you. Partnered with a lot of really great folks, local and regional, as well as our good friends at Psychedelics Today. We're actually hosting this event at the largest cannabis social consumption lounge on the Eastern Seaboard, Higher Ground Dispensary. Really excited to see what comes of it and have a great list of panelists lined up. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. As far as jumping right into state level psychedelic policy roundup touch points, it broke this morning that Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont signed a pilot program expansion bill into law that essentially, on paper, broadens the scope of eligibility for pilot program psychedelic therapy treatment. I believe psilocybin specific in the state of Connecticut. We've talked a little bit about this on the show. A couple of months ago now. We've been at this for a good while at this point. Brought on Victor Costanzo, one of the co-founders of Connecticut for Accessible Psychedelic Medicine, who said pretty plainly that even though this pilot program has existed and been technically partnered with Yale to conduct this kind of psychedelic research and offer treatment specifically to veterans with eligible conditions, not a single dollar in state budgetary funding from Connecticut has actually been allocated to the pilot program. So this expansion is, of course, significant, as it signals that the state of Connecticut is gearing up for FDA approval, which has been heavily noted in the legislative push behind this bill. And it will undoubtedly create or expand the creation of an existing infrastructure in Connecticut to administer psychedelic medicine to eligible residents of Connecticut. So that is not to be discounted, but understanding that right now, this is an on paper move, and that the ball now lies in state lawmakers, court to allocate real funds towards this program so that patients can actually have access. It remains to be seen if that will be a part of the plan moving forward, or if this is, again, something a bit more signatory in recognition that FDA approval is seemingly inbound by the end of this year. On to Minnesota. Where I believe one of the most effective grassroots coalitions in the country resides, based out of Minneapolis, Dr. Jessica Nielsen, an advocacy stalwart across a number of areas. And obviously, as many know, especially if you're involved in any form of political advocacy in this country, the state of Minnesota has been quite a bit of turmoil after the ICE occupations, essentially, of Minneapolis and the death of both Renee Good and I believe Matthew Preddy Alex Preddy was his name. And yet this very well put together, well organized, and persistent grassroots coalition of advocates have come together and advanced really, really well put together piece of psilocybin therapy focused legislation that I would be shocked if Governor Tim Walz were not to sign this bill into law should it reach his desk. So keep an eye on what's coming out of Minnesota, and hats off to the advocates on the ground there for their persistence. It's been a multi-year effort. And as I've highlighted before, I think one of the most fascinating things is the task force report that Dr. Jessica Nielsen and a number of other advocates involved in Psychedelic Society of Minnesota and the broader grassroots coalition. That task force report that they were able to put together actually won an award from an organization that takes the time to read all of these different task force reports that are put together across any number of political issues, and the detail and depth to which this grassroots coalition put together that report so that legislators could be thoroughly informed and properly educated is really remarkable in its own right. So a case study in how to build a coalition over a number of years, and build inroads with legislators over a number of years to the point where real breakthrough legislative change can happen at just the right time, it seems, especially for a community that is in need of healing and progress. And so on to Louisiana, down in the deep south, which I think it's really important to highlight before we even get into the legislation and how we got here, that some of these conservative states might jump off the page at people who are not familiar with the state of academic research in some of these fields, because they are so conservative. It's also worth noting, as we've talked about on the show before, that Louisiana actually is one of, I think, the only state in the union that has banned a number of different plant medicines that are not actually on the CSA. They've banned Amanita muscaria mushrooms, Blue Lotus, have been at the forefront of trying to push kratom and 7-OH bans, from my understanding as well. So it is not a drug decriminalization or drug policy reform safe haven by any means. The city of New Orleans, obviously being as raucous and lively as it is also home to Tulane University, which already has some really fascinating psychedelic research underway, and pretty consistently so. And Louisiana State University as well, LSU, has, I believe, their own Center for Psychedelic Research, standalone, and with a number of partnerships across private and public industry as well. So the progress that has been made in Louisiana vis-a-vis a opioid settlement funded psychedelic therapy program, state regulated access program, that does not just include one particular substance. It is mentions MDMA, ibogaine, psilocybin, and a number of others as potential breakthrough therapies that would be eligible to be funded through this program. And it is another continuation of the opioid settlement funding utilization to advance, be it psychedelic research or actual psychedelic therapy. So Louisiana was really in the midst of a psilocybin revival a couple of years ago, and the task force that had been put together previously was focused almost exclusively on psilocybin, and then in swooped the ibogaine lobby. There has been a lot of chatter, and there was a big hearing in Louisiana earlier this year that featured a number of representatives from the Americans for Ibogaine Ambassadors Lobby, and the rhetoric surrounding which way Western Psychonaut in Louisiana has had quickly pivoted, from my understanding, to a should we lean into ibogaine first. So to see this bill not discriminate against one substance or another is exciting. And then to see the blueprint that Americans for Ibogaine CEO Brian Hubbard has put together over a number of years, beginning in Kentucky, with the utilization of opioid settlement funds to address the addiction crisis, to address the mental health crisis by funding next-gen psychedelic therapy research or care, actual, in practice, clinical practice, is incredibly exciting to see as, again, breakthroughs have happened in Mississippi. Oklahoma now seems poised for their governor to sign an ibogaine therapy focused clinical trial research bill into law. So all of this seems to be further confirmation that the ibogaine wave is ongoing and not going anywhere. Certainly not news to anybody who's been following the space, but worth restating as always, when a breakthrough, like, really, again, one of the most oppressive states for drug policy reform in the country, Louisiana, they're trying to ban the abortion pill. a number of women's health and reproductive health rollbacks as far as women's rights and right to choose, etc. So it is not a progressive, policy-friendly state. So this breakthrough in Louisiana certainly is, without question, historic in its own right, even beyond all of the recently historic news surrounding ibogaine lobbying and ibogaine advocacy reform. Off to a quick start today. So I want to be conscious of time, and if we don't make the full half hour, I certainly think that's more than okay. Some very interesting news broke out of Alaska, which, as anybody who's been following my reporting knows, was making a very unique and truly grassroots driven push for a 2026 ballot initiative that ultimately fizzled out in part because of the difficulties of fundraising amidst a fascistic takeover of American democracy, to put it one way, or a philanthropic drought during a global recession, to put it another. So, been hearing a lot of chatter about the revival of an Alaska campaign in 2028, and it seems, as per Dr. Bronner's All One blog, for those unfamiliar, David Bronner, psychedelic megadonor extraordinaire, and longtime widely used and supportive psychonaut of the movement, of course, has a blog on his company, Dr. Bronner's website, that he often writes and contributes and publishes thoughts on the psychedelic movement at large. And last week put out a piece re-signaling his support for the Alaska campaign, for natural medicine Alaska in particular. What makes this so interesting is the resistance that Alaska faced from the donor class in their 2026 fundraising efforts, largely, it seems, on the foundation, or at least the claimed foundation, that Alaska's inclusion of decriminalization, regardless of incredibly strong polling numbers, I've reported previously 67% in an internal poll conducted by Natural Medicine Alaska in partnership with, I believe, Axiom Strategies, one of the largest conservative, most prominent conservative political consultant firms in the country, found that 67% of Alaska residents were in favor not only of decriminalization of personal use of certain psychedelics, but were also in favor of decriminalizing home cultivation for personal use of certain psychedelics. So numbers that dwarfed the Peasley internal numbers that Massachusetts internal polling generated in the run-up to the 2024 Question 4 campaign that, as many know, failed spectacularly, but also bucks the narrative that was spun in the wake of the Massachusetts campaign by those, and we'll get to this, who may very well, according to some political experts, have tanked the campaign on purpose. We'll talk a little bit about why that might have been. But the narrative that was spun out of Massachusetts, which included the ballot question, the law in question that was on the ballot, featured the same language featured in Alaska, the same language that passed in Colorado back in 2022, and yet failed pretty spectacularly, I believe, 57 to 43 on election day at the ballot box, with 65% of exit of respondents of Massachusetts voters indicating that they weren't even aware until election day that psychedelics were on the ballot. So the narrative that was spun out of that is that voters carte blanche did not want or were not supportive of decriminalization of psychedelics. And that Alaska's insistence upon including it, especially at such a pivotal time with the incoming Trump administration, would make it, even the most promising of numbers curdle at the ballot box if they were given the funding to get off the ground. So what remains, particularly fascinating about the reemergence of psychedelic megadonor David Bronner's support for natural medicine Alaska, not that it went anywhere in terms of ideologically or rhetorically. What's most fascinating about natural medicine Alaska is that this group of grassroots advocates is led by the Regina Randall, one of the co-founders of the Alaska Entheogenic Awareness Council, and an Indigenous Alaskan Native herself, who is the leader of, by proxy, the first and only Indigenous-led ballot initiative in any political topic, political issue of any kind in American history. And it happens to center around psychedelics. So the historic nature, again, we're in the midst of historic, story after historic story when it comes to the psychedelic movement, but the historic nature of what the Natural Medicine Alaska campaign represents is beyond the scope of any one psychedelic issue. Not to mention, again, a majority conservative state with an overwhelming amount of support internally from residents for decriminalizing personal use and home cultivation of certain psychedelics, bucking the narrative that was spun by a lot of the powers that be, seemingly to cover their own asses, so to speak, not even so to speak, to put it pretty bluntly, about the real reasons for why the $7.5 plus million Question 4 campaign failed so spectacularly at the ballot box. And so what I want to hone in on here with what David Bronner's blog post highlighting his support and reaffirming his support for Natural Medicine Alaska's campaign is that he addresses in a pretty flimsy way, with due respect, the reasonable question of, well, this very similar language initiative failed in hyper-progressive, ultra-progressive Massachusetts. What's different now in hyper-conservative Alaska? And while the narrative initially, again, was spun that decriminalization was to blame, that voters weren't on board with that, what David Bronner cites in his blog post is both the misperception that a paid media campaign would carry the Question 4 campaign through in terms of educating voters, but also very specifically blaming the failure or misunderstanding that the electorate had of the ballot summary itself. The question, the law itself, was the summary that the Attorney General ended up listing on the ballot on Election Day. And so to start there as to why this really makes no sense, especially comparative to the evolving narrative that, originally the narrative as to why it failed was decriminalization, and that meant that nobody in any state was going to be supportive of decriminalization moving forward. It has now become the ballot summary is what screwed us. And yet, in my reporting of the multitude of alleged campaign finance violations that the Question 4 campaign stands reasonably accused of by two former staffers, the rule of thumb in any ballot campaign, again, across any political issue, and speaking with experts that have worked in, cannabis and psychedelics, in trans healthcare equality, ballot initiatives, any number of issues. I've spoken with over a dozen political operatives with expertise in this particular field. And the rule of thumb is that if you don't get a ballot summary that really works for you or that is problematic and that makes the bill seem like something it's not, you sue. You sue the Attorney General and you hash it out in court to get a more fairly worded, accurately worded ballot summary. And yet, despite that being the norm, despite that being the rule of thumb, the Question 4 campaign and the powers that be, the establishment operatives that be, chose not to take that to court and fight for a more honest and accurate ballot summary. You got to wonder why that is, especially when money, seemingly with $7.5 million and frequent bonuses to campaign directors, and again, as I've reported, $130,000 plus $1,000 diverted from 501c3 nonprofit partner for the Campaign Heroic Hearts Project to non-military veteran political operatives, advocates, to start a new organization. Why couldn't that money have been put towards suing the Attorney General for a more equitable or reasonable ballot summary for the question? And then furthermore, let's dig into the paid media campaign would see us through logic that, by his own word, Bronner deems faulty. But in hindsight, but as we've reported for Lucid News here at Psychedelic States of America, there were over $500,000 worth of advertisements that were previously reserved by the Question 4 campaign that just months before the election, they chose to cancel. If paid media was the goal to reach the electorate, why'd you run out of money to buy the ads that you needed at the end? Why didn't you set aside that money to accomplish that goal? Furthermore, why did you divert funding to start a new nonprofit that seemingly served no real purpose in service of the campaign? There are plenty of reasonable questions as to why certain choices were made by campaign leadership. And it continues to be worth repeating that so far, leadership of the campaign has not been willing to actually clarify any of the lines of thinking behind said, again, against the political norm, rule of thumb decision-making that was made over and over and over and over again. And it is worth repeating the wise words of one of the, longtime political operatives with experience in ballot campaigns that we quoted in part 3 of our question 4 campaign finance violation expose. Either they ran out of money at the end, either they spent their money irresponsibly and ran out of money at the end, couldn't afford the ad buys, or they tanked it on purpose. If you look at the record, and I would encourage folks to go read all 3 parts of the question 4 campaign finance violation expose series that I, and along with my co-reporter Noah Daly, put out at Lucid News last year. If you look at the record of decision-making, strategic thinking, the way that they spent their money, it is very difficult to come to many other conclusions other than they either spent the money irresponsibly or they tanked it on purpose. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be. I am not necessarily here to speculate as to what those reasons might be one way or another. I've talked a little bit about it before. But I would, again, really encourage folks to think for themselves and to not be convinced one way or another of a political spin that serves little more purpose than to cover the baseline reputational rehabilitation required to be involved in political efforts in a trustworthy capacity with grassroots activists moving forward. And as we enter this week of advocacy extraordinaire here in DC with Cannabis Week of Unity, I think it's really important to consider the implications of advocacy autonomy and the evolution of donor class priorities over grassroots constituency needs. We sit at a very complicated time as far as socioeconomic inequality in this country. And there is no denying that plays out in how political change is made and how popular consensus on key issues that improve the lives of everyday people are often watered down by corporate and or oligarchical interests. We've seen it happen in cannabis, where just broke today, actually, that officially state licensed medical cannabis is now Schedule 3 under federal law, under the Controlled Substances Act, but adult use state licensed cannabis is not. And that has a lot more to do with the oligarchical forces that have quite a bit of profit interest backing their largely medical cannabis-minded state licensed operations in multiple states, working Trump and his team over with $1 million contribution to his presidential campaign in 2024 and a considerable amount of high-priced lobbying to get him around on medical only. But really medical being in name and label only, so as to rapidly shrink the existing federally legal cannabis industry, cannabis market. And I think it's worth asking, regardless of who you are in this movement, regardless of which side of the equation you stand on, political operative, everyday activist, generally interested, psychonaut of casual use, do you look at the record of cannabis legalization in this country over the last decade and a half, and if you're satisfied with the outcomes that the leaders that have led that charge and the financial interests that have backed that charge, if you're satisfied with the reality of state level legal cannabis in the future that we're facing with a medical first in name only kind of federally legal structure that still locks people up, or use outside of medical context, that still prosecutes and criminalizes casual use outside of a highly clinical setting in some states. Are you comfortable with handing the reins of this once in a lifetime movement to those same forces, to those same shepherds? There's wisdom to be learned from the ails and the failures of the cannabis legalization in the Western world. Without question, the psychedelic movement should learn and adapt accordingly from the missteps and mistakes, and adapt, and modify some of the very best policy breakthroughs, some of the very best policy paradigms and frameworks that have been drafted. Get creative, infuse innovation across both worlds. But without accountability for political leadership, we remain both stagnant, but also so often enslaved to the better option of who cares. And I think that is worth considering as we enter an unprecedented era of psychedelic public education and rhetoric, and expansion of discourse. So that's really all I've got on that subject for today. I will just kind of close by again highlighting, as I said at the beginning of the show, we have what I am really excited about, a really awesome event lined up on Friday, the DC Plant Medicine Freedom Forum here in Washington, DC, to close out the Cannabis Week of Unity, with a number of representatives of the Unity Coalition, both on board and in attendance. We've got two really great discussion panels, one that's really focused on like the building blocks and the struggles of plant medicine community building from advocates across the country, with a variety of perspectives on the matter and a couple of different angles that they're coming into this industry from. And then we'll close with a really great panel on the future of psychedelic policy reform in the United States, hosted by Joe Moore, founder of Psychedelics Today, who's going to be in town, and featuring myself, and my good friend Eric Jensen, Director of Government Affairs for the Balanced Veterans Network, which I think is a necessary foil to the evolving veteran advocacy landscape and nonprofit industrial complex behind it of today. But also, I think BVN is poised to take some major leaps and bounds in their visibility in the space as they expand further and further into psychedelic advocacy. So really excited to talk with Eric and Joe on Friday about where some of this is going. And it is going to be, I think, the first of what I presume and really hope will be a series of ongoing events. And again, the largest social consumption lounge on the Eastern Seaboard, right here in the nation's capital. So really like living in the future in some sense, and thrilled to be able to partner with them. So we'll include the registration info for those who might be local or who might be coming into DC for Week of Unity in the show notes. But that's about all I've got today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, my name is Jack Gorsline, the founder of Psychedelic States of America, and an investigative journalist at large. We'll see you next time.